Margaret Thompson had swept the same concert hall floors for 15 years, invisible to the wealthy patrons who filed past her each evening. She knew every crack in the marble, every squeak of the old wooden seats, and every note that drifted from the stage during rehearsals. But what nobody knew, not her supervisor, not the musicians, not even her own daughter, was that Margaret could play every piece by heart. Tonight, when she thought the building was empty, she would touch those piano keys for the first time. What happened next would change not just her life, but the entire classical music world forever. Margaret Thompson pushed her cleaning cart down the dimly lit corridor of the Grandview Concert Hall, the wheels squeaking in their familiar rhythm. At 62, she had perfected the art of being invisible. Patrons in their expensive gowns and tailored suits walked past her as if she were part of the furniture, discussing stock portfolios and vacation homes while she emptied their champagne glasses and swept up their crumbs. The evening's performance of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 had ended an hour ago, but Margaret could still hear the music echoing in her mind. She hummed quietly as she worked, her weathered hands keeping time with the melody that had captivated the audience. Music had always been her secret companion, the one thing that made the long nights of cleaning bearable. "Another late night, Mrs. Dashwood." "Thompson?" called James, the security guard, as he made his rounds. "Just finishing up the main hall," Margaret replied, forcing a smile. She liked James well enough, but she was eager for him to complete his patrol. She had been waiting for this moment all evening. Margaret had discovered her unusual gift quite by accident 3 years ago. She had been cleaning near the piano during a rehearsal when the pianist took a break. Without thinking, she had hummed along to the complex melody, her fingers unconsciously moving as if she were playing the keys herself. The conductor had stopped mid-conversation and stared at her. "Excuse me," he had said, approaching her cart. "Were you just humming the second movement?" Margaret had blushed furiously, stammering an apology, but the conductor, a kind man named Maestro Rodriguez, had been intrigued rather than annoyed. "Have you studied music?" he had asked. "No, sir," Margaret had whispered. I listen." That conversation had lasted only a few minutes, but it had planted a seed in Margaret's mind. Over the following months, she found herself paying closer attention during rehearsals, absorbing every note, every pause, every subtle dynamic change. She began to realize that she could remember entire pieces after hearing them just once or twice. Now, as she pushed her cart into the main hall, Margaret's heart began to race. The stage lights were dimmed to a soft glow, casting long shadows across the empty seats. The concert grand piano sat center stage like a sleeping giant, its polished surface reflecting the amber light. Margaret glanced around one more time to ensure she was alone. James would be checking the upper levels now, giving her at least 20 minutes before he returned. She parked her cart in the wings and walked slowly toward the piano, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. She had never actually touched the keys of a real piano. Her childhood had been spent in poverty, her parents too busy working multiple jobs to afford music lessons. She had married young, had her daughter Sarah at 19, and had spent the next 40 years cleaning offices and buildings to make ends meet. Music had remained a distant dream, something beautiful that belonged to other people. But standing before this magnificent instrument, Margaret felt something she had never experienced before: certainty. She knew, with absolute conviction, that her fingers would know what to do. She lifted the piano bench and sat down, adjusting the height slightly. Her hands hovered over the keys, trembling not with nervousness, but with anticipation. She closed her eyes and let Rachmaninoff's concerto flow through her memory, feeling for the opening notes. Her right hand descended first, finding middle C and beginning the soft, haunting melody that had opened the evening's performance. The sound that emerged was pure and clear, each note ringing through the empty hall with perfect pitch and timing. Margaret's left hand joined in, adding the bass line she had memorized from countless rehearsals. As she played, something extraordinary happened. The music didn't feel foreign or difficult. It felt like coming home. Her fingers moved across the keys with natural grace, finding complex passages and navigating them as if she had practiced them for years. The pedaling came instinctively, her foot pressing and releasing to create the exact sustain and resonance she had heard the professional pianist achieve earlier that evening. Margaret lost herself in the music, her body swaying slightly as she moved through the concerto's first movement. She could feel the emotion in every phrase, understanding the composer's intentions in a way that went beyond technical knowledge. This wasn't just playing notes on a keyboard. This was speaking a language she had always understood but never been allowed to use. The movement reached its climactic moment, her hands flying across the keys in the rapid passages that had made the audience gasp earlier that evening. Margaret played them flawlessly, her muscle memory somehow perfectly calibrated despite never having practiced them. The final notes rang out into the silence, and she sat perfectly still, overwhelmed by what had just happened. Extraordinary. Margaret spun around on the bench, her heart pounding. Maestro Rodriguez stood in the aisle, having entered so quietly she hadn't heard him. His face bore an expression of complete amazement. "Maestro, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean—" Margaret began, starting to rise from the bench. "Please," he said, holding up a hand. "Don't apologize. Don't move. I need to understand what I just witnessed." He walked closer, his eyes never leaving her face. "Thompson, how long have you been able to play like that?"
This was my first time actually touching the piano,"
Margaret admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Maestro Rodriguez sat down in the front row, leaning forward intently. "Your first time? That's impossible. I just heard you play Rachmaninoff's first movement with the skill of a concert pianist. The phrasing, the dynamics, the technical precision. These things take decades to master." Margaret looked down at her hands, still resting on the keys. "I've been listening to rehearsals for 3 years. I remember everything I hear. But I've never had lessons, never studied music formally." "Play something else," the maestro said urgently. "Something we've rehearsed this week." Margaret thought for a moment, then began Chopin's Ballade No. 1, a piece the orchestra had worked on just 2 days ago. Once again, her fingers found every note perfectly, her interpretation mature and nuanced. The maestro's eyes widened further as she navigated the piece's most challenging passages without hesitation. When she finished, he sat in stunned silence for nearly a full minute. "Mrs. Bates, Thompson," he finally said, "what you have is not just talent, it's a phenomenon. I've been conducting for 30 years, and I've never encountered anything like this. You have perfect musical memory and an instinctive understanding of performance that most pianists spend their entire careers trying to develop." Margaret felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. "But I'm just a cleaning lady. I'm 62 years old. This doesn't happen to people like me. Music doesn't care about your age or your profession,"
Maestro Rodriguez said gently.
"It only cares about your soul, and clearly you have the soul of a musician." He paused, considering something. "Would you be willing to play for some other people? I have colleagues who need to hear this." The magnitude of what he was suggesting hit Margaret like a wave. For decades, she had lived in the shadows, invisible and unremarkable. The idea of being seen, really seen, for something extraordinary was both thrilling and terrifying. "I don't know," she said honestly. "This all feels like a dream. Tomorrow I'll go back to cleaning, and this will just be a beautiful memory." "It doesn't have to be," the maestro said. Mrs. Go-To IU. "Thompson, what if I told you that dreams don't have expiration dates? What if this is not the end of your story, but the beginning?" Margaret looked around the empty concert hall, then back at the piano keys that had felt so natural under her fingers. For the first time in decades, she allowed herself to imagine a different future. "What would happen next?" she asked quietly. Maestro Rodriguez smiled. "Next, we change the world's understanding of what's possible." Sarah Thompson Mitchell stared at her mother across the small kitchen table, a cup of cold coffee forgotten in her hands.
"Mom, what are you talking about? You played piano at the concert hall?"
Margaret twisted her cleaning uniform in her lap, unable to meet her daughter's eyes. She had barely slept after her encounter with Maestro Rodriguez the night before, and now, trying to explain it to Sarah, it all seemed impossible, even to her. "I know how it sounds," Margaret said quietly. "But it happened, sweetheart. I played an entire Rachmaninoff concerto movement, and the maestro heard me." Sarah set down her coffee cup with a sharp clink. At 38, she had inherited her father's practical nature and her mother's strong jaw. As a nurse at the local hospital, she dealt in facts and evidence, not fairy tales. "Mum, you've never taken a piano lesson in your life." "I would know. I grew up in this house." "We couldn't even afford a keyboard, remember?" The words stung, but Margaret understood her daughter's skepticism. Their family had struggled financially for as long as Sarah could remember. Margaret's ex-husband had left when Sarah was 12, and they had moved into a small apartment where every dollar was carefully counted.
"I remember everything," Margaret said softly.
But that doesn't change what happened last night. Before Sarah could respond, there was a knock at the apartment door. Margaret's heart jumped. Maestro Rodriguez had said he would come by to discuss next steps, but she hadn't expected him so early. She opened the door to find not just the maestro but two other people she recognized from the concert hall, Dr. Elena Vasquez, the hall's artistic director, and a younger man she didn't know. Mrs. Thompson, Maestro Rodriguez said with a warm smile. I hope you don't mind the early visit. I brought some colleagues who were very interested to meet you. Sarah appeared behind her mother, still wearing her skeptical expression. I'm Sarah, Mrs. Thompson's daughter. And you are? Dr. Vasquez stepped forward, extending her hand. Elena Vasquez, artistic director of the Grandview Concert Hall. And this is Dr. Dagner. Michael Chen, a music cognition researcher from the university. Dr. Chen, a man in his early 30s with an eager expression, practically bounced on his toes. Mrs. Pettis-Soil's horse. Thompson, Maestro Rodriguez has told us about your remarkable abilities. Would you mind if we asked you some questions? Margaret felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention. I suppose that would be all right. Please, come in. The small apartment felt even smaller, with 5 people in it. Sarah hurriedly cleared the breakfast dishes while Margaret offered everyone seats. Dr. Chen pulled out a small recording device. Mrs. Thompson, I study cases of exceptional musical ability. What we call musical savants, or individuals with extraordinary musical memory. What Maestro Rodriguez described to us is extremely rare. Rare how? Sarah asked, her skepticism still evident but now mixed with curiosity. There are perhaps a dozen documented cases worldwide of individuals who can perfectly reproduce complex musical pieces after hearing them once, with no formal training, Dr. Chen explained. Most of these cases involve people who showed musical ability from early childhood to develop this skill at. He paused politely. 62, Margaret supplied. At 62, after years of passive listening, would be unprecedented in the literature. Dr. Vasquez leaned forward. Mrs. Thompson, would you be willing to demonstrate your ability for us? We've arranged for access to a practice room at the conservatory this afternoon. Margaret looked at Sarah, who was staring at the visitors with a mixture of confusion and dawning amazement.
You really think my mother has some kind of gift?
Sarah asked. If what Maestro Rodriguez described is accurate, then yes, Dr. Chen said. A very significant one. 2 hours later, Margaret found herself in a practice room at the Grandview Conservatory, surrounded by the 3 visitors plus 2 additional music professors who had been hastily summoned. A baby grand piano sat in the center of the room, and Margaret felt the same sense of rightness she had experienced the night before. Would you mind playing the piece you performed last night? Dr. Vasquez asked. Margaret sat at the bench and began Rachmaninoff's concerto. This time, playing for an audience of experts, she felt more nervous but also more focused. The music flowed from her fingers exactly as it had before, every note precise, every phrase shaped with the intuition of a master musician. Professor Williams, an elderly man who had taught at the conservatory for 40 years, was the first to speak. In 4 decades of teaching, I have never heard an untrained musician play with such sophistication. Mrs. Thompson, you understand musical structure at a level that typically requires years of advanced study. Dr. Chen was scribbling notes frantically. Mrs. Thompson, would you be willing to try a piece you've never heard before? One of the professors suggested a Mozart sonata that hadn't been performed at the concert hall recently. He played the first movement once while Margaret listened, her eyes closed, her fingers occasionally moving as if tracing the melody. When he finished, Margaret moved to the piano and reproduced the entire movement flawlessly, including subtle interpretive choices the professor had made. Impossible, whispered one of the observers. Vasquez turned to Maestro Rodriguez. You were right to call us. This is extraordinary. She looked at Margaret with new respect. Mrs. Thompson, what you have is not just a remarkable memory, it's musical intuition at the highest level. You understand the emotional language of music in a way that can't be taught. Margaret felt tears threatening again. But what does this mean? I'm still just a cleaning lady. I have rent to pay, responsibilities. Not anymore, Doctor, Vasquez said quietly. Mrs. Thompson, I'd like to offer you a position as artist-in-residence at the Grandview Concert Hall. It comes with a salary, a small apartment near the hall, and the opportunity to work with our musicians and students. The offer hit Margaret like a physical blow.
I don't understand.
Artist-in-residence? Maestro Rodriguez explained. You would be part of our educational program, working with young musicians. perhaps performing in our community outreach concerts. Your story itself is inspiring, but your musical ability is genuinely world-class," Dr. Chen added excitedly.
And if you're willing, I'd love to document your development as a musician.
Your case could revolutionize our understanding of musical learning and neural plasticity. Margaret looked around the room at faces filled with respect and amazement, expressions she had never seen directed toward her. For 62 years, she had been invisible, forgettable, ordinary. Now these accomplished musicians and academics were suggesting that she had something valuable to offer the world.
"I need to talk to my daughter," Margaret said finally. That evening, back in their small apartment, Margaret and Sarah sat at the kitchen table again, but everything had changed.
"Mum," Sarah said slowly, "I owe you an apology. When you told me about last night, I thought you were having some kind of breakdown. The stress of work, maybe loneliness." "I wouldn't have believed it either," Margaret admitted. Sarah reached across and took her mother's hand. "But I saw those people's faces today, Dr. Penge. Vasquez looked at you the way I look at a brilliant surgeon, with professional respect." She paused.
"Mum, you've spent your whole life taking care of other people. First Dad and me, then working to support us. Maybe it's time you did something for yourself." "But the timing feels wrong," Margaret said. "I'm starting a musical career at 62.
Most people are thinking about retirement. Most people don't discover their musical geniuses at 62, Sarah pointed out with a smile. "Mum, what's the worst that could happen? You try something new and it doesn't work out, at least you'll know you tried." Margaret thought about the feeling of her fingers on the piano keys, the sense of coming home to a place she'd never been. "What if I fail? What if this is just some fluke, and I embarrass myself? Then you'll still be my mum, and you'll still be the strongest person I know," Sarah said. "But what if you don't fail? What if you're as extraordinary as those people think you are?" That night, Margaret called Dr. Kelly's. Vasquez and accepted the artist-in-residence position. 2 weeks later, as she packed her few belongings into boxes, Margaret found an old photograph of herself at Sarah's high school graduation. In the picture, she looked tired and worn, proud of her daughter but somehow faded, as if she were already disappearing from her own life. She looked at herself in the mirror now and saw someone different. Not younger exactly, but more present, more alive. Her hands, which had scrubbed and swept for decades, were hands that could create beauty. As she prepared to start the most unexpected chapter of her life, Margaret allowed herself to believe what the experts had told her, that talent has no expiration date, and that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places. 6 months into her residency at Grandview Concert Hall, Margaret Thompson stood backstage, her hands trembling slightly as she listened to the murmur of the gathering audience. Tonight would be her first public performance, a solo recital as part of the hall's Unexpected Artists series. "Mrs. Thompson, 5 minutes to curtain," called the stage manager. Margaret nodded, though her stomach churned with nerves she hadn't expected. During her months of residency, she had worked with Maestro Rodriguez and several piano professors, refining her technique and expanding her repertoire. What they had discovered was that her gift extended far beyond memory. She possessed an intuitive understanding of musical structure that allowed her to interpret pieces with remarkable depth. Dr. Chen had documented her progress extensively, publishing preliminary findings that had caused a stir in musical and cognitive science communities worldwide. Margaret had become something of a phenomenon, but tonight was different. Tonight, she would perform for a paying audience who expected excellence, not just novelty. "Margaret," came a familiar voice. She turned to see Dr. Grew, Vasquez approaching with a warm smile. "How are you feeling?" "Terrified," Margaret admitted with a shaky laugh. 6 months ago, I was cleaning these same backstage areas. Now I'm supposed to walk out there and perform for 300 people. 6 months ago, you were the same person you are tonight, Doctor." Vasquez reminded her gently. "The only thing that's changed is that now the world knows what you're capable of." Through the heavy curtains, Margaret could hear the audience settling into their seats. She peered out and immediately spotted Sarah in the third row, beaming with pride. Next to her sat Dr. God, Chen with his ever-present notebook, and several professors from the conservatory. But what struck Margaret most were the faces she didn't recognize, strangers who had come to hear what the local papers were calling the miracle pianist. The pressure felt overwhelming until she remembered something Maestro Rodriguez had told her during one of their sessions. "Music isn't about perfection, Margaret. It's about truth. When you sit at that piano, you don't need to prove anything to anyone. You just need to be honest with the music."
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Margaret Thompson. Margaret walked onto the stage lights momentarily blinding her. As her eyes adjusted, she could see the faces in the audience, some curious, some skeptical, some openly hopeful. She sat at the piano bench and adjusted her position, just as she had done countless times during practice. She had chosen to begin with Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece that had spoken to her deeply during her months of study. As her fingers found the opening notes, something magical happened. The nervousness disappeared, replaced by the same sense of homecoming she had felt during her first secret performance. The melody flowed from her fingers with gentle authority, each phrase shaped by an emotional understanding that went beyond technical training. Margaret found herself thinking not about the audience, not about the pressure, but about the music itself, its beauty, its melancholy, its hope. As she moved through the Nocturne's dreamy middle section, Margaret became aware that the hall had fallen into complete silence. She could feel the audience's attention like a tangible presence, but rather than intimidating her, it energized her. These people had come to hear music, and she was giving them exactly that. Music in its purest form. The Nocturne concluded with its gentle, questioning final phrases, and Margaret held the last note until it faded completely into silence. For a moment, no one moved or breathed. Then the applause erupted, not polite classical music applause, but the kind of sustained, enthusiastic response, usually reserved for virtuosos. Margaret rose from the bench, overwhelmed by the reaction. She had prepared 3 more pieces, including a challenging Rachmaninoff prelude and a Bach invention, but first she needed to absorb what had just happened. "That was remarkable," came a voice from the wings as she prepared for her second piece. She turned to see James Morrison, the concert hall's longtime security guard who had become something of a mentor during her residency. "Mrs. Thompson, in 20 years of working here, I've heard all the greats. You belong on this stage." The rest of the recital passed in a blur of musical beauty. Margaret performed each piece with growing confidence, her interpretations mature and deeply felt. The Bach was crystalline and precise, the Rachmaninoff passionate and technically flawless. For her final piece, she had chosen Debussy's Clair de Lune, a work that seemed to capture the dreamlike quality of her entire journey. As the final notes of Debussy faded away, the audience rose as one in a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. Margaret stood at the piano, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the response and by the realization that she had just accomplished something she couldn't have imagined a year ago. After the performance, a reception was held in the hall's lobby. Margaret found herself surrounded by patrons, musicians, and music lovers, all eager to meet the woman whose story had captured the public imagination. "Mrs. Thompson," said a distinguished older woman, "I'm Catherine Whitmore from the Chamber Music Society. We would be honored to have you perform at our spring gala." A young man identified himself as a reporter from Classical Music magazine. "We'd love to do a feature story on your journey. What you represent, the idea that it's never too late to discover one's calling, is inspiring people worldwide." Dr. 5. Chen appeared at her elbow, beaming with excitement. "Margaret, I've been contacted by researchers from 3 universities who want to study your case. You're helping us understand human potential in entirely new ways." But it was Sarah's voice that meant the most to her. "Mom, I am so proud of you I can barely speak. You were magnificent up there." As the evening wound down, Margaret found herself alone on the stage for a few minutes, looking out at the empty seats where hundreds of people had just shared in her musical journey. 6 months ago, she had discovered she could play piano. Tonight, she had discovered she could be a pianist. Vasquez joined her on the stage. "So, how does it feel to officially begin your musical career?"
Margaret considered the question seriously.
"Like coming alive," she said finally. "For 62 years, I was a person who cleaned buildings and raised her daughter and paid her bills. Those things were important, but they weren't me. This feels like me." "The board met last week, Doctor," Vasquez said with a smile. "They voted to extend your residency indefinitely and to create a new position for you, Director of Musical Discovery. You'll work with our community outreach programs and help us find other hidden talents in unexpected places." The offer was more than Margaret had ever dared hope for. "Are you serious?" "Completely. Your story has brought attention to the hall and to the idea that musical talent can emerge at any age in any circumstance. We want you to help us look for others like you." As Margaret walked home to her small apartment near the concert hall, she reflected on the extraordinary turn her life had taken.
A year ago, she had been invisible, pushing a cleaning cart through the very halls where she had just performed to a standing ovation. She thought about all the other invisible people in the world, the janitors and bus drivers and cashiers and security guards, and wondered how many of them carried secret talents, unexplored gifts, dreams they thought had expired. Her story, she realized, was bigger than just one woman learning to play piano. It was about the potential that exists in every person waiting to be discovered, regardless of age or circumstance or society's expectations. Margaret Thompson, artist in residence at Grandview Concert Hall, former cleaning lady and current miracle, fell asleep that night planning her next performance and dreaming about all the other undiscovered maestros who might be out there waiting for their moment to step into the light.
1 year after her debut recital, Margaret Thompson sat in her office at Grandview Concert Hall, reviewing applications for the new Hidden Talents initiative she had helped establish. The program sought out undiscovered musical gifts in unconventional places: nursing homes, community centers, workplace programs, and anywhere else talent might be hiding in plain sight.
Mrs. Thompson?
Her assistant, Marcus, poked his head through the door.
Your 2 o'clock appointment is here.
Robert Martinez from the hospital maintenance staff. Margaret looked up from the application files spread across her desk. Each folder represented someone who had been nominated by friends, family, or colleagues as having unusual musical ability despite no formal training. In the past 6 months, her program had discovered a grocery store clerk who could compose symphonies in his head, a retired bus driver who played virtuoso-level guitar, and a hospital orderly who could sing opera arias with perfect pitch. "Send him in, please," Margaret said, straightening her blazer. She still sometimes marveled at her professional wardrobe, a far cry from the cleaning uniform she had worn for so many years.
Robert Martinez entered hesitantly, a man in his 40s with calloused hands and worried eyes. He wore his hospital maintenance uniform and clutched a baseball cap nervously.
"Mr. Martinez, please sit down," Margaret said warmly.
"Thank you for coming. I understand your supervisor recommended you for our program?"
Yes, ma'am. But I think there's been some mistake, Robert said, perching on the edge of the chair as if ready to flee.
Sometimes I hum while I work. It's nothing special."
Margaret smiled, remembering her own disbelief when Maestro Rodriguez had first approached her. "Tell me about the humming, Robert."
"What do you hum?" "Well, I work the night shift, so the hospital is pretty quiet. I listen to classical music on my radio while I clean, and sometimes I change it a little. Make it better. You know, add parts that seem missing."
Margaret's eyebrows rose with interest. "You improvise harmonies?"
Robert looked confused. "I don't know what that means. I just hear how the music could be different, richer." "Have you ever written any of this down? Or played it on an instrument?" "I can't read music, ma'am, and I've never owned an instrument. But sometimes," he hesitated, then continued in a rush, "sometimes I hear whole orchestras in my head, complete pieces with every instrument playing its part. My wife thinks I'm crazy." Margaret felt the familiar thrill of discovery.
She had learned to recognize the signs, the apologetic tone, the assumption that their ability was somehow inadequate, the disbelief that anyone would find their musical gifts interesting. "Robert, what if I told you that some of the world's greatest composers couldn't read music when they started?
What if I told you that the ability to hear complex musical arrangements mentally is extremely rare and valuable?" Over the next hour, Margaret guided Robert through a series of simple tests. She played recordings of various classical pieces and asked him to describe what he heard, what he would change, what was missing. His responses revealed a sophisticated understanding of musical structure and an innate sense of harmony that would have impressed any composition professor. "I'd like you to meet with Dr. 11. I agree with Dr. Bradwa, Chen from the university," Margaret said finally. "And with our composer in residence. Robert, what you have is a gift for musical creation that could benefit the entire classical music world."
"But I'm just a maintenance worker," Robert protested.
"I didn't go to college. I don't know anything about music theory."
"Neither did I," Margaret said gently.
"Robert, talent doesn't require permission. It doesn't need diplomas or pedigree. It just needs recognition and nurturing." After Robert left, clearly overwhelmed but cautiously hopeful, Margaret turned to her computer to find 3 new emails. One was from a documentary filmmaker in Los Angeles who wanted to feature her program in a film about late-blooming artists. Another was from a symphony orchestra in Chicago, inviting her to perform a solo concert with them. The third was from her daughter Sarah. "Mom," the email read, "I know you're busy changing the classical music world, but don't forget you have a grandson who would love to see his famous grandmother." Can you come for dinner Sunday? Also, I have news to share. Margaret smiled, realizing she had been so caught up in her new life that she hadn't seen Sarah and her family in nearly a month. Success, she had learned, brought its own challenges, mainly the challenge of remaining grounded and remembering what truly mattered. That Sunday, Margaret sat in Sarah's kitchen, bouncing her 3-year-old grandson Tommy on her knee, while her daughter prepared dinner. The domestic scene felt surreal after a week of meetings with music directors and interviews with journalists. "So what's this news you mentioned?" Margaret asked. Sarah turned from the stove with a glowing smile. "I've been accepted into the nurse practitioner program at the university. I'll be starting in the fall." Margaret felt a surge of pride and joy. "Oh, sweetheart, that's wonderful. You've wanted this for so long. I know the timing is challenging with Mike's work schedule and Tommy, but watching you chase your dreams inspired me to chase mine too," Sarah said. "You taught me that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be." "Grandma plays piano," Tommy announced suddenly, as if this was the most important news in the world. "Yes, she does," Sarah said, ruffling his hair. "Would you like to hear Grandma play?" Sarah's small, upright piano sat in the living room, a recent purchase she had made for when Mum visits. Margaret settled at the bench with Tommy on her lap and began playing a gentle melody. Not a famous classical piece, but an improvisation that had come to her during a recent evening walk. As she played, Margaret reflected on the unexpected turns her life had taken. 2 years ago, she had been invisible, forgotten, convinced that her best years were behind her. Now she was mentoring other hidden talents, performing for audiences worldwide, and inspiring people to discover their own postponed dreams. But sitting here with her grandson, playing music in her daughter's cozy living room, Margaret realized that her greatest accomplishment wasn't her sudden fame or her remarkable story. It was the lesson her journey had taught others. That potential has no expiration date, that dreams deferred are not necessarily dreams denied, and that the most beautiful music often comes from the most unexpected places. "Grandma," Tommy said as she finished the improvisation, "will you teach me to play piano?" Margaret looked down at his eager face, then at Sarah, who was watching with tears in her eyes. "I would love to," Margaret said. "But first, let me teach you something even more important. Let me teach you to listen, really listen, to the music that's all around us." As the evening wound down, Margaret realized that her story had come full circle. She had discovered her gift by listening to others play. Now she was teaching the next generation to listen for their own hidden talents. The woman who had once been invisible was now helping others step into the light, one discovered dream at a time. And that, Margaret thought as she hugged her family goodbye, was the most beautiful music of all. 5 years after her discovery, Margaret Thompson stood in the green room of Carnegie Hall, adjusting her concert gown and trying to calm her nerves. Tonight she would perform with the New York Philharmonic in a special concert celebrating her Hidden Talents initiative, which had now spread to over 50 cities worldwide. The program had discovered hundreds of untapped musical gifts: a homeless veteran who composed haunting melodies, a grandmother who could conduct orchestras with intuitive brilliance, a teenager from the inner city who created symphonies using only smartphone apps. Each discovery had reinforced Margaret's belief that musical talent existed everywhere, waiting to be recognized and nurtured. 5 minutes, Miss Thompson," called the stage manager. Margaret still felt a small thrill when people called her Ms. Thompson in these contexts, not Mrs., as if her identity was defined by marriage, and not the cleaning lady, as if her previous work somehow diminished her worth. She had become simply Margaret Thompson, pianist, and discoverer of hidden talents. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in." The door opened to reveal Robert Martinez, now dressed in a tuxedo and carrying a violin case. Over the past 5 years, Robert had become one of her program's greatest success stories. His innate ability to hear and create complex harmonies had led to a scholarship at Juilliard, where he was now studying composition. Tonight he would perform his own violin concerto with the Philharmonic. "Mrs. Edge Thompson, I wanted to thank you one more time before we go on stage," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. 5 years ago, I was cleaning hospital floors and hiding my music in my head. Tonight, I'm performing at Carnegie Hall. This is because you believed in me. Margaret embraced him warmly. No, Robert, this is because you had the courage to share your gift with the world. I just helped you find the door. Another knock revealed Dr. Chen, now co-director of the Hidden Talents Initiative and author of a groundbreaking book about late-emerging musical ability. His research with Margaret and her discoveries had revolutionized understanding of human musical potential. "Margaret, there's someone here who wants to meet you," he said excitedly. She came all the way from Scotland after reading about tonight's concert. Behind him stood an elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes, wearing a simple black dress. Ms.
Thompson, I'm Fiona MacLeod, the woman said in a lilting Scottish accent. I'm 85 years old, and until I read about your work, I thought it was too late for me to share something I've kept secret my entire life.
Margaret's heart began to race with recognition. She knew that look, that tentative hope, mixed with fear.
What is it you've kept secret, Fiona? I compose songs, hundreds of them. Folk songs mostly, but some classical pieces too. I've written them down in my own notation system that I invented as a child, but I've never shared them with anyone. When I read about you discovering your gift at 62, I thought, perhaps it's not too late for me either. Margaret felt tears gathering in her eyes. Even after years of discoveries, stories like Fiona's still moved her deeply. Fiona, it's never too late. After tonight's concert, I'd love to hear some of your compositions. In fact, our next initiative is focused specifically on finding hidden talents in senior communities. As the conversation continued, Margaret marveled at how her life had become a catalyst for others to step forward with their secret gifts. She had created a movement built on the simple idea that talent has no expiration date, and that society's assumptions about who can be an artist are often wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your final call. Margaret, Robert, and the other featured artists made their way to the wings. Through the curtains, she could see Carnegie Hall filled to capacity. In the front row sat Sarah and her family, including Tommy, now 8 years old and taking piano lessons. Behind them were rows of people whose lives had been touched by the Hidden Talents Initiative. Former participants, families of discoveries, and supporters of the program. As Margaret walked onto the stage, the audience rose in a sustained standing ovation. She knew it wasn't just for her musical ability, though that had continued to develop and mature over the years. The applause was for what she represented, the possibility that dreams can come true at any age, that potential exists in unexpected places, and that one person's courage to pursue their calling can inspire thousands of others to do the same. She sat at the piano as the orchestra prepared for her concerto, a piece specially commissioned for tonight's concert by a composer who had been discovered through her program. As Maestro Rodriguez raised his baton, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The concerto began with a simple melody, not unlike the quiet humming she had done while cleaning these very halls years ago. But as the piece developed, it grew into something magnificent, a musical representation of all the hidden talents waiting to be discovered, all the dreams deferred but not forgotten, all the potential that exists in every human heart. As Margaret's fingers danced across the keys, she thought about the cleaning lady who still lived inside her, the woman who had spent decades invisible and overlooked.
That woman was still part of her, but she was no longer hidden.
She had become a beacon for others who felt invisible, a living reminder that transformation is possible at any age. The concerto reached its triumphant finale, and as the last notes echoed through Carnegie Hall, Margaret realized that her story was really just beginning. Tomorrow, she would return to her work finding hidden talents. Next month, she would open the first international conference on late emerging artistic ability. Next year, she would launch scholarship programs for older adults pursuing artistic dreams. But tonight, as she stood on the stage of one of the world's most prestigious concert halls, receiving applause from an audience that included both dignitaries and former janitors, Margaret Thompson knew that the most important thing she had accomplished was proving that extraordinary lives can begin at any moment. The woman who had spent 62 years cleaning up after other people's dreams had become living proof that it's never too late to pursue your own. As the curtain fell on her Carnegie Hall debut, Margaret smiled, knowing that somewhere in the audience, perhaps a security guard or an usher or someone cleaning the lobby, might be the next person ready to discover that their time to shine had finally come. The music, after all, was just beginning.